And particularly being in Windsor, for me, Windsor is her, so she loved it here. She spent most of her time here. Showing you around today is very much a case I'm trying to make sure I'm doing it the way she'd want you to see it.
There is a particular kind of stillness that royal households are trained into. Prince Julian of Aldervine learned it in the army, in a mortar pit outside a city whose name he was never allowed to say aloud afterward. Princess Isabel learned it differently in front of 1,000 cameras at 18 on the morning her engagement was announced, when she discovered that her face could be studied like a weather system and she would still have to smile through it. Between them, they had built a marriage out of composure. Neither one of them ran from anything. That is what makes the night they did run worth telling. It began, as these things nearly always do, with paperwork. A routine subsidence survey had been ordered for Thornfield Hall, the modest house on the royal estate where Julian and Isabel had chosen to raise their 3 children instead of the grander, colder wings of the main palace. Thornfield had been Isabel's idea. She wanted her son and daughters to grow up somewhere with a kitchen she could stand in, a garden with a gate that actually locked, walls that didn't echo. The surveyors were meant to be gone by lunchtime. They were not gone by lunchtime. Beneath the cellar of Thornfield, behind a section of brick that predated the current house by at least 2 centuries, one of the engineers found a cavity that shouldn't have existed. Behind the cavity was a passage. The passage did not stop. By the time the estate's head of security, a taciturn former Royal Marine named Owen Price, was called down into the dark with a torch and a radio, the survey team had already traced the tunnel 40 meters under the lawn without finding its end. Price made one phone call. Within 2 hours, Thornfield Hall had been quietly, wordlessly cleared. Julian and Isabel were not told gently. There is no gentle way to tell 2 parents that something has been found underneath the room where their children sleep. Price met them in the hallway outside the nursery wing, and the look on his face did the talking before he opened his mouth. Isabel did not wait for him to finish the sentence. She was already moving toward the children's doors. 6-year-old Freddie was carried out half asleep, his cheek against his father's shoulder, one shoe missing because it had come off somewhere between the bed and the stairs. 8-year-old Sophie asked, with the directness only children manage, whether they were in trouble. 11-year-old Oliver said nothing at all, which worried his mother far more than any question could have. They left in the back of an unmarked car at 1 a.m, driving past hedgerows that had, until that night, represented the safest place either of them knew. Isabel looked back once. The house sat lit and empty behind them, a shape she no longer entirely trusted. By dawn, forensic tents had gone up across the south lawn, one over each newly discovered entrance to what investigators were now calling, with grim understatement, the network. Detective Superintendent Naomi Reyes, brought in for her background in historic property crime and her clearance to work inside royal security protocols, arrived with a team carrying ground-penetrating radar. What the radar returned by mid-morning made her ask for the deputy commissioner directly rather than filing the usual report up the chain. The tunnels did not stop at Thornfield's boundary. They ran on toward the old stable block, toward a disused ice house nobody on staff had thought about in a generation, and worse, toward 2 other properties on the wider estate where minor members of the family sometimes stayed. For years, possibly decades, there had existed a way to move beneath the entire estate that no camera, no guard rotation, and no perimeter fence had ever accounted for. That alone would have been a security failure worth a very uncomfortable inquiry. It was not, on its own, a crime. Old stone doesn't hurt anybody. What turned this from an infrastructure scandal into something else entirely was what Reyes's team found in the 3rd chamber. They searched a space directly beneath the room where Freddie slept. Someone had been living there, not for a night. A folding chair, worn soft at the seams, a camping stove with a full gas canister, and 3 empty ones stacked beside it. A stack of paperback books, spines cracked from repeated reading, and photographs, dozens of them, printed on ordinary paper, pinned to the stone wall with drawing pins. Not old photographs, recent ones. Isabel walking Sophie to the estate's small private school. Julian jogging the same loop every morning at the same hour. The exact 10-minute window repeated across a dozen different pictures when the overnight security detail changed shift and the grounds went quietest. That is not the behavior of someone who stumbled onto a hiding place. That is the behavior of someone conducting surveillance. The chamber's contents were dated, roughly, by investigators cross-referencing product packaging and a half-legible newspaper used to line a shelf. The earliest items were close to 2 years old. 2 years. Reyes made her team say the number out loud in the briefing room before she'd let anyone move on to the next slide, because she wanted it to land the way it needed to land. 2 Christmases. 2 summers of Sophie and Freddie playing in the garden while their mother watched from the kitchen window. Every ordinary Tuesday of that entire span, someone had been lying in the dark below them, watching and writing. The notebooks came out water-damaged, but salvageable. A forensic document examiner spent 4 days coaxing pages apart without destroying them. What she found was, in its own way, more disturbing than the photographs. The early entries were dry and procedural times, weather, staff rotations, notes on which door in the ice house was easiest to force. Somewhere around the 40th page, the tone changed. The author began referring to Isabel by her first name, without title, in the voice of someone describing people he knew personally. He wrote about the little one Freddie with a fondness that made the examiner, by her own account, physically step back from her desk. He had never spoken a word to any of them. He had built an entire relationship out of photographs taken through a gap in a wall, and somewhere in the writing, he had stopped seeing it as watching and started experiencing it as knowing. Digital forensics found him within 36 hours, though by then he was already gone. A moderator on an amateur history forum flagged a user, posting under the name Ash Grove Digger, who had spent 18 months publishing increasingly detailed theories about forgotten passages beneath royal land theories that lined up, almost exactly, with the tunnel map Reyes's team had just spent a week building from scratch. The account traced to Desmond Caro, 49, a former archivist who had lost his position at a regional heritage trust 3 years earlier after what colleagues described, carefully, as an increasingly rigid fixation on unverified local legends about buried royal treasure. He had no family listed as next of kin. He had, according to his last known landlord, spent almost every waking hour of the past 2 years on research he described only as finally proving them wrong. Dr. Priya Ashworth, a forensic psychologist who had consulted on obsessive fixation cases for the better part of 2 decades, reviewed the notebooks and gave Reyes assessment that didn't comfort anyone. The pattern was familiar to her. Interest hardening into study, study hardening into grievance. Grievance eventually producing a narrative in which the person being watched becomes, in the watcher's mind, an obstacle rather than a stranger. Caro, she said, had likely stopped believing he was trespassing on someone else's home months ago. In his own account of events, he was owed something, and the family living above him was simply in the way of him collecting it. By the time officers reached the rented outbuilding 3 miles from the estate that Caro had been using as a staging point, it was empty, not ransacked packed. He had known, within hours of the tunnels being discovered, that his access was gone. And he had left with whatever mattered to him and nothing else. A search of the outbuilding turned up further research, unfinished, on 2 other royal properties. He had not been planning to stop. King Edmund received the briefing from Reyes's superiors at the older, larger palace across the county, and by every account kept his composure through the entire meeting. It was only afterward, on the phone with his son, that anyone close to him described a change in his voice. The reasons were not hard to guess. Nearly every institution built to protect that family had, for 40 years, been designed around the assumption that a threat comes from outside a wall and has to climb, has to be seen, has to cross an open lawn under a camera's eye at some point before it reaches a door. Nobody had built a plan for a threat that was already underneath the floor. There was an older grief in the room, too, one nobody needed to say aloud. The family had, within living memory, lost someone to exactly this, not a tunnel, but the same underlying horror, a lens they could never fully account for, watching from an angle they hadn't thought to guard. Every person in that briefing understood the shape of what they were circling without anyone naming it directly. The children absorbed the aftermath the way children absorb most things sideways, and not on any schedule the adults could predict. Freddie developed a fear of basements that made bath time. Oddly, the hardest part of any evening, for weeks, Sophie began checking the latch on her bedroom window every night, sometimes twice, a small ritual her mother chose not to interrupt because she understood, watching her daughter's face in the doorway, that Sophie needed the ritual more than she needed to be told the doors were already secure. Oliver, at 11, did the thing his father recognized instantly and painfully because he had done it himself at roughly the same age. He stopped asking questions out loud and started standing at windows instead, watching the tree line the way a much older person watches for weather. Julian found him there one evening and said nothing for a while before finally sitting down on the sill beside him. Their conversation was short. Julian had promised himself, long before Oliver was born, that his children would never have to carry a fear alone simply because a household had decided fear was something you didn't discuss. That promise got its first real test that evening, and he kept it, even though the honest answer to his son's question, "Is the man still out there?" was yes. 3 weeks after the evacuation, Julian and Isabel walked through Thornfield together for what both of them understood, without saying it, might be the last time as a family that actually lived there. The security upgrades were extensive and entirely justified sealed passages, motion sensors buried in the walls themselves, a redesigned perimeter that accounted for what lay beneath the ground as carefully as what stood above it. None of that was the problem. The problem was that a house cannot be made to forget what happened inside it, even when the people who love the house desperately want it to. Isabel stood in the kitchen where she had made 3 birthday cakes and understood, with a kind of grief that had nothing to do with the tunnels themselves, that Thornfield had stopped being the answer to the question she and Julian had asked each other before Oliver was born, whether it was possible to raise children who were royal without raising children who belonged entirely and only to the public. They issued a short statement. The palace called it necessary infrastructure work. The public called it whatever the public calls anything it doesn't fully understand: speculation, sympathy, a scattering of flowers left quietly at the estate gates by people who had no real information and simply wanted, in some small way, to say they were sorry a family they'd never met had been frightened in their own home. Desmond Caro has not been found. The investigation remains open, technically active, though the trail has gone cold in the way these trails often do. A man who spent 2 years being invisible on purpose does not become easy to find simply because his hiding place was discovered. Detective Superintendent Reyes still keeps his file on her desk rather than in the archive drawer where closed cases go. There was never any treasure under Thornfield. There was old stone, groundwater, and 4 centuries of forgotten paperwork, nothing that could have justified what Caro gave up to go looking for it. What he actually took, in the end, wasn't gold. It was a family's certainty that their own bedrooms were theirs alone. Whether he understands that, wherever he is now, is not something anyone can say. Julian and Isabel have not decided, publicly or privately, whether they will ever move their children back into Thornfield once the work is finished. On a cold evening, not long before Christmas, the two of them stood together at a window in their temporary quarters, watching the children argue cheerfully over a board game in the next room, and talked instead about spring, where they might live, what kind of garden it might have, whether a gate could ever again feel like it was simply a gate and not a boundary someone had already found a way underneath. Neither of them said the obvious thing out loud. Some houses, once you know what you know about them, don't go back to being just a house. You can seal every tunnel. You can install every sensor on the list. The knowledge stays exactly where it landed the night you first heard it, and no security upgrade in the world has ever found a way to reach that.